There's a universe of difference between a lie and a delusion. A lie is a weapon you aim at someone else. A delusion is a fortress you build around yourself, and you've mortared the stones with so much fear and self-deception that you've forgotten you're the one who built it. When a young man named Mark walked onto my stage, I could see the fortress. I could see the high walls, the battlements. I could practically smell the boiling oil he was ready to pour on anyone who dared to get close. His parents, Carol and David, sat on the other side of me, and they looked like they'd been living under siege for a decade. They were exhausted. Their eyes were hollowed out from worry and betrayal. They had come to me with a story that's tragically common. A son in his late 20s living at home, unemployed, and according to them, stealing them blind. Mark's story, of course, was different. In his version, he was the misunderstood artist, the free spirit whose conventional parents were trying to crush his soul. He wasn't lazy, he was finding himself. He wasn't a thief, he was just borrowing against a future inheritance, or there were misunderstandings about missing items. He carried the label they had given him, the ungrateful, parasitic child, like a shield. He had polished it so much it shined, using it to deflect any and all responsibility. My first impression of Mark, before he even said a word, was that he was a man who had become terminally comfortable with his own story. He had rehearsed it, refined it, and believed it with every fiber of his being. The problem with a fortress like that is that it doesn't just keep other people out, it keeps you locked in. My job wasn't to tear down the walls from the outside. That never works. My job was to find a way to get him to open the gate himself. Before any guest sits on that stage, my team and I do a deep dive. We look at everything, we talk to everyone, we watch hours of tape from their life at home. With Mark, the tapes were telling. You could see the dynamic plain as day. Carol would ask him gently if he'd looked for a job that day. He'd explode, not with simple anger, but with a wounded, theatrical indignation. How can I possibly be creative when you're constantly breathing down my neck? You don't believe in me, you never have. He was a master at turning any question about his behavior into an indictment of their character. He'd accuse them of being materialistic, of not understanding his artistic journey. His father, David, a man who had worked the same factory job for 35 years to give his family a stable life, would just shut down. You could see the confusion and pain in his eyes. He'd provided everything he was supposed to provide, yet here was his son accusing him of being the source of all his problems. The pattern was textbook. Mark was raised as the golden child. He was clever, he was charming, and everything came easy to him in his early years. His parents, like most loving parents, mistook potential for accomplishment. They praised his intelligence, not his effort. So he learned a dangerous lesson. The appearance of success was more important than the work it took to achieve it. When life started to get hard, when he hit the real world after a couple of semesters of college and found that charm and a quick wit weren't enough, he didn't have the tools to cope with failure. Because in his mind, failing at something meant he was a failure. That was an existential threat he couldn't face, so he retreated. He went back home to the one place where he was always the star, but the world inside that house had changed. He wasn't a promising teenager anymore. He was an adult man with no prospects, and his parents' pride had slowly curdled into fear. The fortress he built wasn't just to protect him from their judgment. It was to protect him from his own terrifying reality. The reality was that he was scared. He was terrified of stepping out into the world and finding out he wasn't as special as he'd always been told he was. It was easier to be the oppressed artist in his parents' basement than a nobody in the real world. That was the core of it. The stealing, the lying, those weren't the problem. Those were the symptoms of a much deeper disease, a profound and paralyzing fear of his own mediocrity. The stealing started small, as it always does. A $20 bill from his mother's purse, his father's credit card used for a video game purchase online, followed by a theatrical performance of shock and a promise to help figure out who hacked the account. Carol and David, bless their hearts, wanted to believe him. It's a powerful thing, a parent's desire to see the best in their child. They'd explain it away. He must have just needed gas money and was afraid to ask. He's under so much pressure, he's not thinking straight. They were making excuses for him, which is just another way of saying they were co-signing his behavior. They were teaching him unintentionally that there were no real consequences. Every time they accepted a flimsy excuse, they laid another brick in that fortress wall. The escalation came when the stakes got higher. It wasn't just cash anymore, it was items with sentimental value. A watch David had gotten for his 25th anniversary at the plant, it vanished. Mark's story was that he'd borrowed it for an important meeting with a gallery owner and had misplaced it. He promised, with tears in his eyes, to find it. He put on a whole show of turning his room upside down, but the watch never reappeared. The final, earth-shattering blow was Carol's mother's wedding ring. This wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a legacy. It was the one thing Carol had left of her mother, and she kept it in a small velvet box in her nightstand. When she went to look at it one day, the box was empty. That was the moment the denial shattered for Carol. The pain in her face when she recounted this to me backstage was raw. It was the look of a mother who had just realized she was living with a stranger. When she and David confronted Mark, the explosion was nuclear. He didn't just deny it, he went on the attack. He accused them of being careless. You probably lost it and you just want someone to blame, he screamed. Then he turned it on his mother, twisting the knife. You're always so dramatic, Mom. You're making this up to make me look bad so you have an excuse to kick me out. He was a cornered animal, and he was lashing out with everything he had. He was using her grief and her love as weapons against her. That's a level of manipulation that is chilling to witness. David, however, had reached his limit. The quiet man had finally had enough. While Mark was performing his tirade, David had slipped out of the house. He drove to every pawn shop within a 10-mile radius. In the third one, he found it. The owner remembered Mark clearly, described him to a T. David didn't just get the ring back, he got a copy of the receipt complete with Mark's signature. When he walked back into that house and laid that receipt on the kitchen table, the silence was deafening. He didn't yell, he didn't scream. He just looked at his son, his voice barely a whisper, and said, "Explain this." And here's where the delusion becomes truly impenetrable. A normal person caught dead to rights would break. They'd confess, they'd apologize, they'd show remorse. Not Mark. His brain simply could not allow for the reality that he was a thief who had stolen his own grandmother's ring. That reality would shatter his entire identity as the misunderstood genius. So in that split second, his mind manufactured a new reality, a new narrative, so convoluted it was almost impressive. He looked at the receipt, looked at his parents, and said, with a straight face, that he had taken the ring to a special jeweler to have it professionally cleaned and appraised as a surprise for their anniversary. The pawn shop? Oh, the jeweler worked out of the back. It was an unconventional setup. He was just holding the money for him as a deposit. The story was absurd, riddled with holes, but he delivered it with the conviction of a true believer. He wasn't just lying to them, he was lying to himself. and he believed his own lie more fiercely than they believed the truth. That was the moment they knew they had lost him. That was the moment they picked up the phone and called us. They weren't just dealing with a liar or a thief. They were dealing with a mind that was actively rewriting reality in real time to avoid accountability. And that is a very, very dangerous place to be. So there we were. Mark looking defiant and slightly bored, as if he was just waiting for us all to catch up to his superior intellect. Carol, weary and heartbroken, clutching a tissue. David, stone-faced, the quiet anger radiating off him. I started by giving Mark the floor, letting him tell his version of events. I let him paint the picture of the struggling artist, the misunderstood visionary, the victim of his parents' narrow-mindedness. He spoke of the financial pressures that were stifling his creativity, the lack of support that forced him into these misunderstandings. He was eloquent, he was articulate, and he was completely detached from the reality of his actions. It was a performance, a well-rehearsed monologue designed to evoke sympathy and deflect blame. I just listened. I let him go on until he had exhausted every excuse, every deflection, every dramatic pause. He thought he was winning, articulating his truth. But what he was really doing was exposing the cracks in his fortress, brick by brick. Then I turned to Carol and David. I asked them to calmly and factually recount their side of the story. No histrionics, no name-calling, just the timeline, the missing items, the growing fear, the specific instances of their trust being violated. They laid it all out. The missing cash, the unauthorized credit card charges, the anniversary watch, and finally, the grandmother's ring. As they spoke, Mark would interrupt, interjecting with exasperated sighs, rolling his eyes, muttering things like, "Oh, here we go again with the dramatic embellishments." He couldn't help himself. Every accusation against him was a personal affront, a challenge to his carefully constructed identity. He had to maintain control of the narrative, even if it meant undermining himself in the process. When David calmly presented the pawn shop receipt, complete with Mark's signature and the description of the ring, Mark's demeanor shifted just for a split second. A flicker of something, maybe panic, maybe just annoyance that his parents had done their homework, but it was quickly replaced by that practiced indignation. He doubled down on his ridiculous story about the unconventional jeweler. He even added some flourishes describing this imaginary jeweler as a reclusive genius who preferred cash and dealt in the shadows. He was so deep in the delusion, he couldn't see how transparent he was. He was literally making it up as he went along, believing that if he just kept talking, kept asserting his version, it would somehow become real. That's when I knew it was time. Time to stop playing by his rules, time to stop letting him control the narrative. I looked him straight in the eye, cutting off his latest stream of fabricated details. My voice was calm, but firm. "Mark," I said, "you are a grown man, you are 28 years old, you live in your parents' house, you don't contribute financially, and you have, by your own admission, borrowed or misplaced valuable items from them repeatedly. You just told us a story about a reclusive genius jeweler who operates out of a pawn shop and takes grandmother's rings for cleaning and appraisal without documentation, and yet requires you to hold on to the money for him. Do you hear how ridiculous that sounds? Do you hear what you're saying?" He bristled. "You don't understand my situation, Dr. Phil. You don't understand the creative process, the struggles of an artist. My parents just don't get it." He was trying to pivot back to his victimhood, to the misunderstood artist narrative. That's his default setting. "No, Mark." I cut him off again, leaning forward slightly. "I understand perfectly well the struggles of artists. I've worked with many. What I understand is that you're using art as an excuse for irresponsible, dishonest, and frankly, parasitic behavior. And that's not struggle, Mark, that's evasion. You're not struggling as an artist, you're struggling to avoid being an adult. The air in the room got thick. Carol gasped softly. David just stared. Mark's face flushed, and for the first time, the defiance began to crack, replaced by a raw, naked anger that wasn't just performance. He was angry because someone was finally calling him out, not on the symptoms, but on the disease itself. He was angry because I was chipping away at the foundation of his delusion. The real confrontation, the moment I knew we were getting somewhere, wasn't when I was yelling at him or when he was yelling back. It's usually quieter than that. It's when you manage to strip away all the noise, all the defenses, all the carefully constructed narratives, and you get to the raw truth. I saw a sliver of that in Mark when he reacted to my calling his story ridiculous. It was a primal reaction to being exposed. Mark, I continued keeping my voice steady. Let's set aside the fantasy for a moment. Let's talk about reality. Your reality is that you are living in your parents' home dependent on them. Your reality is that you have repeatedly taken things that don't belong to you, things that have significant sentimental value. Your reality is that you have lied about it over and over again, to the point where you've concocted a story about a fictional jeweler who operates out of a pawn shop. The question isn't whether your parents understand your art, Mark. The question is, do you understand the consequences of your actions? Do you understand that stealing is wrong? Do you understand that lying to the people who love you and support you is destructive? He just sat there, his jaw tight, eyes darting between me and his parents. He looked cornered, but not in the way he usually performed cornered. This was genuine. The arrogance was still there, but it was laced with something else, a dawning realization that his performance wasn't working anymore. His parents weren't buying it. The audience, me, wasn't buying it. You talk about your parents not supporting your dreams, I pressed on. But let me ask you this. How can they support dreams that you never articulate beyond I want to be an artist? What does that mean? What are you actually doing to achieve this dream? Are you painting? Are you sculpting? Are you writing? Are you networking? Are you taking classes? Or are you just waiting for inspiration to strike while you're playing video games and rifling through your mother's jewelry box? He flinched. That was a direct hit. He had no answer. His entire narrative was built on the idea of the suffering artist, not the work of the artist. He wanted the accolades without the effort. He wanted the identity without the responsibility. I'm working on things, he mumbled, his voice losing its earlier conviction. It's just a process. A process that requires your parents to fund it indefinitely? I ask, not unkindly, but with a hard edge of truth. A process that involves them living in constant fear that you're going to steal from them? That's not a process, Mark. That's a burden. And you are placing an unacceptable burden on them. Then I turned to Carol and David. You have enabled this. You've given him the benefit of the doubt when he didn't deserve it. You've made excuses for him when he should have been held accountable. You've loved him into this state of irresponsibility. And now you're paying the price. The question for you is, are you willing to continue paying this price? Are you willing to let your son destroy himself and your relationship with him? Carol started to cry softly. We just want him to be happy, Dr. Phil. We just want him to find his way. And is this his way, I ask, gesturing towards Mark? Living a lie? Stealing from the people who love him? Is this the path to happiness? David, who had been silent for a long time, finally spoke. His voice was steady, filled with a quiet resolve. We love our son, but we cannot live like this anymore. We cannot live in fear in our own home. We told him he needed to leave, to get his own place, to stand on his own 2 feet. But he refused. He said he couldn't afford it, that he needed us. So we're here. We need help. We need to know how to move forward, how to get our son back, or at least how to protect ourselves. I looked back at Mark. His face was pale. The defiance was gone, replaced by a kind of stunned silence. It was as if the sheer weight of the truth, spoken so plainly, had finally broken through the fortress. He wasn't shouting anymore. He wasn't spinning tales. He was just there, exposed. And in that moment, I saw not the con man, not the parasite, but the scared young man underneath. The one who was terrified of failing, terrified of not being special, and who had built an elaborate prison to avoid facing that fear. This was the breakthrough, not a sudden epiphany, but a crack. A tiny hairline fracture in the wall he had built so high, and in that moment of silence, that quiet surrender of his usual defenses, I saw a flicker of hope. It wasn't a grand pronouncement of change. It wasn't an apology filled with tears, but it was something far more real, a visible discomfort with his own narrative. He was starting to feel the weight of his lies, the hollowness of his excuses. He had painted himself into a corner, and the elaborate story he'd crafted about the pawn shop jeweler had finally backfired, not because his parents disbelieved him, but because even he, on some deep level, must have known how ludicrous it was. I turned to him, my tone shifting, becoming less confrontational and more guiding. Mark, you've been given a lot. A roof over your head, food on the table, parents who, despite everything, still clearly love you. That's a foundation most people would kill for. But you've taken it all and you've squandered it. You've used their love as a crutch, their home as a sanctuary from responsibility. And in doing so, you've not only hurt them, you've betrayed yourself. You've settled for a life of playing a victim, of being the oppressed artist, because the alternative, the messy, difficult, uncertain work of actually becoming an artist, of actually becoming an independent adult, felt too daunting. I paused, letting that sink in. The truth is, Mark, you're not a victim of your parents. You're a victim of your own fear. And that fear has manifested as entitlement, as dishonesty, as manipulation. These aren't character traits of a successful artist or a happy individual. These are traits of someone who is stuck. And the good news is, being stuck is not permanent, but you have to want to get unstuck. You have to be willing to do the hard work. And that work starts with admitting the truth, not just to us, but to yourself. The ring wasn't at a jeweler's. You pawned it. You needed money and you took it from your mother, from her memory of her mother. Can you say that, Mark? Can you admit that much truth? The silence stretched. His chest rose and fell rapidly. His eyes were fixed on the table. I could see the internal struggle, the pride, the ego, wrestling with the undeniable evidence and the crushing weight of his parents' pain. Finally, barely audible, a whisper that seemed to get lost in the vastness of the studio. Yes, it wasn't a thunderclap. It wasn't a dramatic sob. It was a quiet, almost defeated admission, but it was there. It was a crack, a genuine crack in the fortress. Carol let out a shaky breath and reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she gently touched his arm. He didn't pull away. David watched them, his expression unreadable, but there was a subtle softening around his eyes. Okay? I said, my voice softening too. Okay, that's a start. That's a massive start. Now that truth, that admission, it needs to be the foundation for something new. You can't build anything on lies. So what happens now, Mark? Do you continue to live in the rubble of your deception, or do you start to rebuild? And if you want to rebuild, you have to be willing to do the work. That means finding a job. That means moving out. That means facing your fear of failure head on and developing resilience. It means understanding that art isn't just about inspiration. It's about discipline, about perseverance, about showing up even when you don't feel like it. It's about contributing, not just taking. I then looked at Carol and David. You two have been enabling this for too long. Out of love, yes, but it has been destructive. You need to set firm boundaries. He needs to leave this house. He needs to be financially independent. He needs to understand that the consequences of his actions are real and that you are no longer willing to shield him from them. This is not about punishment, it's about tough love. It's about giving him the opportunity to grow up and become the man he's capable of being. It means that when he falters, and he will falter because life is hard, you can support him, but you cannot carry him. The goal is for him to become a functional, contributing member of society, and ultimately a good son. But that journey has to start with him taking ownership. The rest of the show was spent laying out a plan, not a magic wand, but a concrete path forward. For Mark, it meant finding employment within 2 weeks, securing his own living situation within 2 months, and engaging with a therapist to address the underlying fears and anxieties driving his behavior. For Carol and David, it meant establishing clear financial and living boundaries, communicating with a united front, and seeking their own counseling to process the years of hurt and betrayal and to learn how to navigate this new dynamic. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There was no sudden transformation where Mark became a world-renowned artist overnight. The cracks were there, yes, but the fortress was still standing, albeit damaged. The real work, the hard work of dismantling it from the inside and building something new was just beginning. But for the first time, Mark wasn't actively reinforcing the walls. He was tentatively looking at the damage and perhaps, just perhaps, considering stepping out into the light. The weeks following the show were, as expected, a whirlwind. There's a saying I use, the only thing that changes behavior is the consequence. And for Mark, the consequence was the public exposure of his actions, the unified front of his parents, and the clear, actionable plan we had laid out. It wasn't a guarantee of success by any stretch of the imagination. Change is a process, often a messy one, and relapse is always a possibility, especially when you're dealing with deeply ingrained patterns of behavior. But there was a tangible shift. He left his parents' home, not to a penthouse suite, but to a small, shared apartment with a roommate. It wasn't ideal, but it was his own space, a place where he had to be responsible for himself. He secured a job, not as a celebrated artist, but as a barista in a local coffee shop. He complained, of course. It wasn't glamorous, the pay was modest, and his hands smelled like coffee grounds all day. But he went. Every morning he showed up. He learned to interact with customers, to manage his time, to deal with the daily grind, both literally and figuratively. This was the hard work I had talked about. It wasn't about creating masterpieces. It was about proving to himself that he could be reliable, that he could contribute, that he could earn his own way. His parents, Carol and David, were incredibly strong. They held the boundaries we had discussed. When Mark called, complaining about his job or asking for extra money, they gently but firmly reminded him of the plan. "We love you, Mark," they'd say, "but you've got this. You're doing so well, keep at it." It was agonizing for them, I know. Years of ingrained habits of rescuing and enabling don't just disappear overnight, but they were committed. They understood that true love meant allowing their son to learn and grow, even if it meant he stumbled along the way. They also started attending therapy together, not just as a couple, but individually. They needed to process the years of hurt and to rebuild their own sense of security and trust, not just in Mark, but in their own ability to set healthy boundaries. There were moments, I'm sure, when Mark felt overwhelmed. Moments when the old urge to retreat, to blame, to lie, must have resurfaced. The comfort of the fortress, the familiar narrative of the misunderstood victim is seductive. But he had started to taste something else, the quiet satisfaction of accomplishment, the feeling of earning a paycheck, of paying his own rent, of being able to buy his own coffee without asking for money. These were small victories, but they were building blocks. They were chipping away at the foundation of his fear. He wasn't suddenly a model citizen, but he was showing up. He was doing the work. I received an update a few months later from his parents. It wasn't a dramatic Hollywood ending. Mark hadn't suddenly discovered his artistic genius and sold a masterpiece, but he had kept his job. He had remained living independently. He was even starting to save a little money. He had even, on his own initiative, enrolled in a community college art class, not to become a famous artist, but to learn specific techniques he had always talked about. He was engaging with his passion in a structured, responsible way for the first time in his life. He wasn't borrowing supplies, he was buying them with his own earned money. The most telling part of the update was this. Carol mentioned that one evening while they were having dinner, Mark called. He didn't call asking for money or complaining about his life. He called to ask David for advice on fixing a leaky faucet in his apartment. David, with a quiet pride in his voice, guided him through it. It was a simple, mundane conversation, but it was monumental. It was a father and son connecting on a level of mutual respect and shared responsibility, not on a basis of obligation and manipulation. Mark was learning to be a man, and Carol and David were learning to be parents who could trust him not with their possessions, but with their hopes for his future. It's a long road, this journey of change. For Mark, the scars of his past would likely remain. The temptation to fall back into old patterns would always be there. But what I saw, and what I believe his parents saw, was a fundamental shift. The fortress hadn't been completely demolished, but the gates were open. He was no longer a prisoner of his own delusion, but an architect of his own future. And that, my friends, is a victory worth celebrating. It's not about perfection, it's about progress. It's about choosing to build something new, even when the old foundations are shaky. It's about the courage to face the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, and to take that truth, however small, and use it as the first brick in a more authentic life. The story of Mark, Carol, and David is a testament to the fact that change is possible, but it is rarely instantaneous or easy. It's a slow, often painful process of dismantling deeply ingrained patterns and rebuilding trust, both within oneself and with others. The progress I saw after the show was encouraging, a testament to their commitment to the plan we laid out. But the truth is, life doesn't stop when the cameras stop rolling. The real work happens in the quiet moments, in the day-to-day decisions, in the resilience to get back up when you inevitably fall. Mark's continued employment at the coffee shop, while seemingly mundane, was crucial. It provided him with structure, financial independence, and a tangible sense of accomplishment. Each paycheck was a small victory, a confirmation that he could indeed provide for himself. This countered the narrative he had long held. the one where he was incapable, where his only value lay in his potential, his artistic promise that never seemed to materialize. He learned that competence, reliability, and hard work had their own quiet dignity and satisfaction. It wasn't the applause of an audience, but it was the quiet nod of a satisfied customer, the appreciative glance from his manager, the knowledge that he had earned his keep. These were the building blocks of self-esteem, solid and earned, not fragile and performative. Carol and David's commitment to maintaining boundaries was equally vital. It's human nature to want to rescue our children, to smooth out their rough paths. But in doing so, we can inadvertently infantilize them, preventing them from developing the resilience they need to navigate life's inevitable challenges. Their consistent refusal to bail Mark out financially, while undoubtedly difficult, sent a clear message. We believe in your ability to handle this, and we will support you from a distance, but we will no longer carry you. This was not a lack of love. It was an act of profound love, allowing Mark the space to fail, to learn, and ultimately to succeed on his own terms. Their own therapy helped them process the emotional toll of years of anxiety and betrayal and to reestablish their own well-being. They were learning to trust their instincts again, to trust that they could create a healthier dynamic within their family. The fact that Mark enrolled in an art class not with the immediate expectation of becoming a renowned artist, but to learn specific skills, was particularly telling. It signaled a shift from a passive, aspirational identity to an active, learning one. He was no longer waiting for inspiration to strike like lightning. He was showing up to learn the craft. This demonstrated a developing maturity, an understanding that talent without discipline is merely potential unrealized. It was a subtle but significant change in his approach to his passion. He was moving from the idea of being an artist to the practice of being an artist. This grounded approach, focused on skill acquisition and consistent effort, was the antithesis of his previous grandiose fantasies and evasive tactics. The phone call asking David for advice on a leaky faucet was, in my estimation, the true turning point. It represented a reclamation of their father-son relationship. It was a conversation based on shared problem solving and mutual reliance rather than obligation and guilt. It was Mark reaching out for guidance, not for a handout. It was David offering his experience, not as a rescuer, but as a mentor. This was the kind of healthy interdependence that makes families strong. It showed that Mark was beginning to see his parents not as ATMs or sources of validation, but as individuals with wisdom and experience to share, and that he was willing to engage with them in a constructive, respectful way. Ultimately, Mark's story is not a closed chapter. Life is a continuous unfolding. There will be challenges. There will be moments of doubt. The allure of the easy path, the comfortable lie, might always whisper in the back of his mind. But what we witnessed, and what his parents now witness daily, is the emergence of a young man who is willing to do the work. He's not perfect, and he never will be. None of us are. But he has taken a critical step away from the suffocating embrace of delusion and towards the challenging yet liberating reality of self-responsibility. The fortress walls are down, and while the landscape outside might be daunting, it is also filled with the genuine possibilities of an authentic life, built not on fantasy, but on the solid ground of truth and effort. And that, in my book, is a profound and hopeful outcome.